Thank you. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, back live with the Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland. I am so delighted to have Brooke MacKenzie on about her book, Ghost Games. And I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen, even with my chaos, Brooke, right?
Well, I've had some chaos as well, but now the stars have finally aligned and here we are.
Well, yeah. Although my misstep earlier this morning, and then it's like, I've said this a million times, well, not quite a million on air, there are very few good things about aging. I entered my 70th year, and it becomes I don't want to, not an excuse, an explanation for, I'll say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm an old man. I've always been chaotic, disorganized, discursive brain, just chaotic. Yet now I can say, and everybody, younger people are always so understanding. I don't want to say forgiving. It's like, oh, it's okay. I said, I'm sorry, I'm an old man. So
I have the new mom excuse, although she's about to turn 2. So that's
tell me about that. Tell me
starting
about
to wear a little thin.
Tell me about the new mom excuse.
So I'm a little bit on the older side in terms of the age that you are when you become a new mom. So it's been a bit of an adjustment. It's been a crazy 2 years actually, because my husband and I were living in New York City I was pregnant when COVID hit, and we were quite nervous about the whole thing, obviously, because we lived a block and a half away from, a whole bunch of hospitals and an emergency room and everything. And then COVID started to spread in our building. So these were early days of COVID. So we left and came to Northern California, where my husband is from and where we had been building a house for the last several years, and came to a small town. And so it wasn't necessarily the plan for me to have my daughter out here in Northern California, but I did, and we have stayed, and we just recently moved into our new house, and
it's wonderful.
It's been great. But yeah,
you had to be very, forgive me. Yeah, I mean, that had to be very unnerving, isn't the word, frightening.
Yeah.
Again, the early first on a lot of levels, we still don't know a lot about COVID, right. I believe. And it's not a criticism on anybody in the medical profession, but those early days, and you were pregnant, had to be terrifying.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, definitely. So, it's been a whirlwind of a few years, because we moved into my husband, a family member of my husband's house. We had the house to ourselves, which was great, but it wasn't until recently that we sort of had our own space. So I was sort of navigating new motherhood, cross-country move, not having our like real home. So it was a lot, but it's all worked out beautifully. But yes, that all is just to say that I fully understand, when when the brain kind of isn't tracking as well as it should be. Yeah, I have a delightful, almost 2-year-old. Her name is Maeve, and she is beautiful. She's absolutely wonderful, and everything is good. Everything has worked out.
It's all good now, yeah.
And then, of course, in the midst of all this, I'm, trying to get this book published, and yeah.
Wow. That's a lot. Again, being pregnant in the early days of at any time through COVID.
Yeah.
Your concerns had to be, again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Frightening. Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that all worked out well. I have to ask you a little bit more about your background. You spent your formative years living in a haunted house.
Yeah.
You said, but that's another story. Do you mind?
No, not at all. Yeah, we lived in this fantastic old house. I'm from a small town a suburb of Minneapolis called Wayzata, Minnesota. And the whole town is just kind of, has a really interesting history. And I'm thinking at some point I may sort of try to try to do a little more in sort of delving into the history of the town and writing a novel about it, or even kind of a true paranormal book. We'll see. But in any case, yeah, we had this fabulous house, and there were definitely a few different entities that inhabited it. I think there was one that sort of hung out mostly in the basement. And that one, was a little more sort of hostile. And then there was a more benevolent one that lived in sort of the upper parts of the house, and in particular the kitchen. And that one seemed to be, have a little bit, of a kinder energy. And then there was an entity in the woods, and we had like a little sort of shed in the woods, and that was where I would sort of see, I would have the most kind of intense experiences. That entity showed itself to me several times, and it was pretty intense.
Do you feel that you're more sensitive to that's something part of your makeup, that some people would not feel that entity? You do?
Yes. And it actually got to a point eventually when I was in college, when I decided that I didn't want to be sensitive to entities any longer. And actually, I went to a very haunted college. I went to Sarah Lawrence College just outside of New York City. And that place is crawling with ghosts. And I had sort of a crazy encounter with an entity my senior year. I mean, I had a few crazy encounters, but I had one in particular that really kind of shook me. And at that point, I sort of asked the powers that be to kind of take that sensitivity or ability, or whatever you want to call it, away from me. And I now kind of wish I hadn't, because I sort of missed being able to see ghosts and connect with spirits in that kind of a way. But it gets to be too much sometimes. I have had a couple of experiences here and there since then where I've been very aware of an entity, but it's not sort of at the same level that it was when I was younger.
That's just, maybe it'll come back more. Who knows, right?
You never know. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't mind it.
I'm not comparing the two things, but I was chatting with a psychiatrist once, and we were just talking about stuff, and he said, "Louis, do you hallucinate?" And my response was, "How would I know?" Because again, he said, "Well, do you see things that someone else wouldn't or doesn't?" I said, "Well, it doesn't mean it's not there. Maybe they're just not seeing it." We got into this whole thing. How would I know? How would I know?
Right.
And we delved into it more, but it's just, it's, I'm not comparing the two, but how would I know? Right?
I mean, how would you know? Exactly. And I think there's still, there's a lot about the brain, that I think we still don't understand, and sort of the way that the brain can connect with things that aren't sort of necessarily visible to the human eye. And I mean, I certainly am a big believer, obviously, in ghosts and
Yes.
the paranormal, and I know that science sort of likes to explain things away, but I don't know. It just because science has one explanation doesn't necessarily mean that these things don't exist. We just.
I agree with you. It may be different for different people, and I hate to say whose science, and I know I'll get arguments about that from physicians and PhDs about science. Yet I dare say, and I'm not getting political about this, but what we've learned with COVID, there were different, they always say, follow the science. Well, which one?
Right.
Because I would have I had a guest on that talked about vaccinations, getting vaccinated and wearing masks. I had another physician on that cited studies where they're not effective. So
Yeah.
and they're physicians. So which science do I buy into, I guess?
And the same is true. My background is as a teacher and a reading specialist, and it's fascinating because you can find research, like legitimate peer-reviewed research to sort of back up completely differing claims. Exactly. It's sort of, who's science.
Yeah.
But yeah, just one thing I just want to add too is, they're now starting to declassify like UFO.
Yes. Yeah.
And now, so there's a lot that we don't understand about the world and about the world beyond our world. And,
Certainly. Yeah. It's interesting with the UFO stuff. I never thought it would cycle back. Question, you're right about.
But like people high up in, government and, like people are baffled and they're, starting to admit the existence of some of these unexplained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
they
interesting.
May not attribute it to aliens, but either way, they just don't understand what's happening necessarily. So I don't know.
We're learning. We're constantly learning.
Yes.
About things. So who knows what it'll be like about seeing ghosts or entities or spirits, what we'll learn in the next 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, who knows?
Yeah.
You'll know more because you'll be around in 20 years. Certainly. I won't be.
You will be. Oh my goodness.
90? Going into my 90th year? Look what the last 7 decades of more. I'm not being fatalistic. I've just
things just took a dark turn.
Not yeah. Again, Brooke MacKenzie's book, Ghost Games, Play at Your Peril. A couple other questions. Again, and we've got links up to your website, or go directly to bamackenzie.com, MacKenzie.com. And again, I'm glad you've got time because I'm kind of really fascinated about your background. Let me just say about reading. And I'm a huge supporter of our library system. I always have I love my library shirt. I've got a collection of them. And when I read studies about how people are getting out of high school and really, I don't want to say unable to read, but struggle with reading. The way I would always say it is they're given a diploma that they can't read. And it's in 2022, I can understand it many, many decades ago when our country was very different. Now it's like, how can that be? I spoke with a teacher in this area who told me that she teaches, I think, 3rd and 4th grade. She's got 4th grader that is reading at the kindergarten level. And I kind of wonder, and I know, and they're pushed to move the kids forward. Well, if you're that far behind, how do you catch up? And it's just, I can't imagine being unable to read. I don't want to imagine.
No, it's very hard. And that's why I'm a reading specialist. And I've taught in a variety of settings, including, very sort of urban public and charter schools, and also, international schools and private schools. And now I'm in my own private practice as a tutor. But it's incredibly disheartening when you see kids that are unable to read for whatever reason. There's a myriad of reasons that, why students get to 4th grade and, can
not reading,
sound out words. And it's
again, how do they catch up at that point? I mean, I guess if someone, was a parent saw that and got a tutor like yourself and were very consistent with it, they could be brought up to grade level. Yet that's just doesn't happen often
Right.
enough.
And a lot of parents don't have the resources or,
Sure.
access to super highly trained professionals or, and yeah, a lot of school settings are not as ideal as they could be for the
Sure.
teaching of reading. And then you have, students who are English language learners. And so, like recent immigrant populations, and
Sure.
but
Yeah.
some, so then they're navigating a whole new language and culture. So they certainly have their plates filled. So yeah, there's and then there are undiagnosed,
Of
learning
course. Yeah.
disabilities that happen. It was interesting because I taught in Arizona for 4 years, and this was in the early 2000s. I don't know if this is true now, but in the early 2000s, the state of Arizona used to look at the third grade illiteracy rates, because third grade really is, just a huge year in terms of, if students aren't sort of at grade level in third grade, it then just becomes harder and harder to catch up, because then, the texts become more demanding. You're doing more. You're no longer learning to read, you're reading to learn.
Learn.
And so
Yeah,
if you're
that's great.
still trying to play catch up and learn to read, then it becomes more difficult to access the curriculum. But anyway, the state of Arizona used to look at the third grade illiteracy rates, and that's how they would determine how many prisons to build.
Oh.
Now, again, I don't know if that's the case now.
Yeah.
I know it was that way in the early 2000s. Yeah.
That's frightening.
Really just obviously a strong connection between
Oh, sure.
and being, and able to be a productive member of society.
I get that, and not that's how they should be building prisons. But if you're unable to read, you can't even fill out an application for a job. Unless you're really good or have a good labor job. What do you do?
And it's hard because our job market is becoming more and more, I don't know, I guess the word would be bifurcated, where it's like, that there's it's harder to sort of find those like mid-level jobs, with upward mobility. I mean, it's like, and I feel like now more and more, some of the labor jobs are starting to become replaced by machines and by robots, and that's going to happen more and more. And then, what does that mean for, for folks who haven't had access to excellent educational opportunities, or, who have struggled in school and haven't had support and the kinds of resources that they've needed to be successful. And I do just want to say one other thing, going back to when I was talking about English language learners, or I guess the term now is emerging bilinguals. That's the term to use. But it's important, if there are any bilingual families listening to this right now, to really encourage your child's native language development, and to read to your child in their native language. Don't feel like, oh, they have to learn English, they have to learn English. The stronger foundation they have in their native language, the more successful that they're going to be in becoming bilingual.
That's interesting. That is really interesting. I just quickly need to say hi to Jack at the shop around the corner, and good morning here to you also. The interesting thing I'd like to talk with you about, and we are going to get into the book.
Yeah,
we are. But your background, you spent 2 years in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
That was incredible. It was incredible. I worked for a family that was building an international school, and essentially what they wanted, so they were Thai, of course, and they wanted to establish a really high quality school where Thai children could get an international education. That has sort of become more and more the trend in Thailand, especially among some of the more, I would say, elite families, where they want to send their kids to international schools, and then very often they go overseas to boarding schools or universities in the US or the UK. And so this family wanted this excellent program in which students sort of had access to an American curriculum, but that was sort of culturally relevant to Thai students. We incorporated a lot of a lot of sort of Thai practices and customs, and making sure that students were greeting grown-ups in the correct way, that they were learning sort of how to function effectively in Thai society as well. And we did a lot of discussions and lessons around all the different festivals and holidays, and learned a lot about.
For you.
What's that?
Wonderful for you. Wonderful experience for you. Quickly, do you like Thai cuisine?
Yes.
I'm a huge fan of Thai curries.
Yes.
And it was great.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's hard though, because it's hard to find like truly authentic Thai cuisine in the US. I mean, even in New York City, there's one restaurant in Queens. Sorry, there's my daughter. There was one.
Do you need to check?
No, I'm fine. No, her dad's got it. There was one restaurant in Queens that had, truly authentic Thai cuisine. It just, the flavors are different, and, the vegetables are different. And so I really was so spoiled living there for 2 years and eating the most incredible food.
Yeah, there is a restaurant in this community that does some Thai curry. It's Thai dishes, and the one of the owners is Thai. I mean, it's you need to, oh.
Hi, honey.
Your wife was telling wonderful stories about you.
Right.
Did you hear?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. Again, he's Thai, so obviously he makes them, and I get him to make them. I'm vegan, so no fish sauce, and I have to call in advance, and they'll do and it's wonderful, and some of them are really hot, so I love that. I'm sorry, I went off on. I like to cook, so I try to make them at home, and they're okay, but they're not as good as when someone makes them.
Yeah, and it was just such a lovely country. It's a lovely place to live, and just it was wonderful sort of getting to know and understand the culture, and I also got to travel all over Southeast Asia, which was wonderful. So
that had to be. I love that with your background, so broad, so diverse, the different things, and that was very cool when I read that in your bio. And that is BAMacKenzie.com, BA MacKenzie, MacKenzie.com. Ghost games. Tell me about that. I always say that, like the tipping point where you said, I'm going to write this book.
It was fascinating, actually. I was never going to be a fiction writer. I mean, that was never anything I planned to do. I love writing nonfiction. I've actually written a memoir about growing up in a haunted house. I don't think it will ever see the light of day. I don't think I'll ever publish that, but I mean, who knows? Never say never. But it really sort of got the juices flowing in terms of wanting to write horror. But yeah, I've written lots of articles, personal essays. I wrote this memoir, and then I've written a lot of poetry. I have quite an extensive poetry background, and fiction just never really interested me. And I was listening to a podcast, and it was sort of one of those fictional podcasts where they're, it's like they're telling a story. And they talked about the story of Elisa Lam, who she's not mentioned by name in the book because my publisher didn't want to use her name, but she is featured in the story The Elevator Game. And she's also featured in a documentary on Netflix, like a documentary series on Netflix called, I believe, like Crime Scene at the Cecil Hotel, But it's Elisa Lam was a young woman who was from Canada and was traveling through the United States, and she stayed at the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles, which is a notorious place, and it no longer exists. I mean, it's now like some fancy hotel, but it's had a very dark history. Like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, stayed there when he was going on his crime spree. It was one of the last places that the Black Dahlia was seen before she was murdered. You had all kinds of sort of deaths and seedy characters and everything. In any case, this young woman was last seen on a surveillance camera in an elevator. And, she seems to be, it's almost like she's speaking to someone, and she's hiding behind the panel, but she's completely alone. And she's just behaving very erratically. And the elevator's also acting really weird. Like the elevator doors aren't closing. And so she's kind of peeking out of the hallway. And then, at one point it looks like she's speaking to someone who's not there. And that was the last time she was seen alive. She was later found floating in the water tank on the roof. So, I'm not going to spoil the Netflix documentary series in case anyone wants to check it out. But one of the theories that, a bunch of sort of web sleuths or whatever had was that she was playing this paranormal game called the elevator game. And in the elevator game, you press a series of buttons, and in doing so, you're sort of transported into another dimension. So I heard this story about this young woman, and the elevator game just kind of popped into my mind. Oh. And I went home and I wrote it in one sitting, and it's like it just kind of poured out of me. And I was very surprised by it because, again, fiction was never really going to be my MO. And then I just was like, that was kind of fun. I wonder if there are any other paranormal games that I could write about. And then boom.
Wow. And it just came to you. That's interesting. Yeah. It kind of, I don't want to say it wrote itself, but it was just, you wrote it, of course, but it's just like, there it was. It just.
Yeah. I mean, and as I tell people, I do have a very vocal muse. There is sort of this creative voice that tells me what to do. And she's often she can be a little challenging to work with because sometimes she'll wake me up in the middle of the night and be like, hey, you have to write this right now. And then other days, she'll go weeks without speaking to me. So yeah, so I'm definitely a believer in the muse, and the muse just kind of, created this work. So
that's interesting. That process is interesting. I had a novelist on, well, actually he's been on numerous times, and he'll tell me that the characters, if he's writing something, the character speaks to him and said, I wouldn't do that. I mean, I've never heard anything quite like that. And say that they actually, and that's fascinating. I know what you mean about fiction. And years ago, I still generally like to have nonfiction authors on, and more so years ago. And because and this is outing myself, I know it sounds terrible. I got pitched a novelist, and I'm thinking, what am I going to ask him? So tell me about the story you made up. Well, and I know that sounds terrible when I say it. I didn't say it to him, but it was interesting because, again, writing is challenging, I'm sure, for most. Yes, nonfiction, you're going to base on things. In fiction, you're creating characters and worlds, which, yeah. That's it. Go ahead.
Well, and I definitely mine, I mine my real life, for content and for characters. I mean, every single character in Ghost Games is based on, either a version of me or a version of someone in my life. So, and in fact, actually, one of the stories in the book, The Closet Game, is set in a house that's based on the haunted house that I grew up in. And in the closet game, there's this big walk-in vault in the basement. And there was one of those in our creepy haunted house as well. So, just I do tend to sort of mine my life for ideas and characters. And that's why I said earlier, it'd be interesting to do some fiction work, possibly around the town where I grew up, and to sort of mine that history as well. But we'll see.
Yeah, I have a feeling you're going to do it. You'll do it. I don't know how you have time to do all the things you do, but you do. I've got to ask you about Chase, your dedication to Chase, a kindred spirit.
Yes. Chase is my niece. And she is just, she's just the most spectacular little soul. Well, I shouldn't call her little. She's in high school, but she's the most spectacular soul. And she and I love watching horror movies together and reading horror books together. And, we read It together, and it's just, we just have this connection through horror. And she was definitely my most dedicated reader. As I was sort of churning out these stories, she would want to read them, and she would even actually give excellent feedback. So nice. She's just a wonderful fellow horror lover.
Wow, that is interesting, and I appreciate you explaining that. Tell us about the closet game. I've got a lot of questions for you about different chapters. You mentioned closet.
Yeah, so the closet game again is sort of based, the protagonist in that story is kind of based on a version of teenage me. And there's another character in the story named Rue, who sort of has to come in and save the day. And she is loosely based on my best friend from high school, who is still currently my best friend. It was fun kind of revisiting those old versions of us, and just remembering what my friend was like in high school, and sort of transporting myself back into the mindset of a teenager who lives in a haunted house and who happens to be bored and dateless on a Friday night, and so decides to play this paranormal game. And yes, it was that one actually, people say is one of their favorites. That I've heard that feedback. I am not going to say which of these stories is my favorite.
I wasn't going to ask. They're all your favorites, right? You wrote them, so
I feel like my muse would get mad at me if I were to pick one. So yeah.
Possibly, very possibly. I'm talking with Brooke MacKenzie, book Ghost Games, and I've got the you don't mind if I pick a few of the stories that are, and talk a little bit about them.
Please.
Bloody Mary. I have to tell you this, and I don't know if you've ever heard of the cartoon. Yes, at my age, I still like some cartoons. Pickle and Peanut.
Oh, I don't know.
They had an episode called Gory Agnes. And I love Pickle and Peanut. And
check it out.
I think it's a little more obscure. I don't know, but they did. And it I put notes in the book by Bloody Mary about Pickle and Peanut and Gory Agnes. Tell us about Bloody Mary.
So it's funny because that one was actually like a last minute addition. I had already submitted the book to my first publisher, and that relationship actually ended up not working out. So I've worked with a different publisher, or I was rescued by a different publisher, but I had already sent the manuscript to that first publisher. And again, the muse, my rather opinionated and sometimes fickle muse, was just not happy. And I hadn't really wanted to do Bloody Mary, just because, that's a game that everyone sort of knows. And it was important to me to pick paranormal games that weren't maybe as common, or that, people didn't necessarily know as much about. But yeah, the muse just kept tapping me and was like, nope, this book isn't done and you need to do a Bloody Mary. So I did, and actually, even after I had submitted the book to my publisher, when we were doing, the big round of sort of content edits, I decided that I didn't like the original version. So I changed it quite a bit. So yeah, so that one's been through a lot of changes and wasn't even going to be included in the original manuscript.
That's it. That's interesting. I appreciate you explaining. Can you talk just a little bit about the premise for Bloody Mary? What, not giving everything away, obviously, but.
So what it sort of became, what kind of evolved into is, the protagonist in that story, that protagonist isn't actually super based on me. That protagonist is a little more, one of the ones that's more different from me. But it's about this young woman who is, she's nannying for a wealthy friend of the family, and the little girl decides to play this game and to play Bloody Mary, which in case you're not familiar, which, I'm sure everyone is, where you turn off all the lights in the bathroom mirror and, you cross your arms and you say Bloody Mary, or, I made up a little chant, for them to invoke Bloody Mary. And supposedly this woman, comes through the mirror and kills you. But what it sort of became for me as I was writing it and thinking about this protagonist, she really just sort of didn't fit in. Went to an elite all-girls school in Manhattan, and has just graduated college, and really just is kind of struggling to kind of find her place in the world, and to find her. She certainly didn't really fit in high school, and I just sort of had this feeling of Bloody Mary as not only being a scary paranormal entity, but sort of representing the way that she felt judged and watched by the people in her life. And, the way that Bloody Mary kind of lurks and watches. So, there is sort of that like real life connection where sometimes the people in our lives can almost haunt us as much as entities would. And, again, not to give everything away, but she sort of goes through this learning curve where she just decides that she has had enough of everyone's tomfoolery and, learns to not care as much about what inconsequential people or entities might think of her.
And I love the disclaimer about do not play these games and play at your peril.
Yes, I do not recommend playing any of these games in the book.
Yeah, just don't, right?
And the book does have an appendix with instructions to play the games. Again, I don't recommend that you play them. I included the instructions for the games just to sort of give the readers a richer experience, just to sort of, because I don't go into detail about all the instructions in all the stories. And so I included the instructions just to, hopefully make the whole experience of reading the book a little bit richer and to kind of flesh out some of those details. And a lot, a theme that does run through this story is oftentimes the protagonists don't always follow the instructions the way that they should. Or, they sort of veer off and do their own thing. And then, the results aren't ideal. So that's also why I included the instructions, just so you could kind of see where they go a little off book.
It's fascinating. A couple other things I want to talk about with you, if you're good time-wise, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Top of the hour, you're listening to Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland, copyright B. Free Radio Limited, 2022, produced by the lovely Miss Bunnyface in cooperation with White Rabbit Productions. I'm having the pleasure of talking with Brooke MacKenzie about her book, ghost games play at your peril. I mean, I love that. And I don't do this at home, right? Yeah. For listeners, Brooke just held up the book. So that I love that. And it's really interesting read how you, and then to think that you develop these, I just find is really, really fascinating. I do want to talk about the Ouija board. It reminded me of two very weird experiences that I had probably 35 or more years ago, probably closer to 40 years ago. Yeah, the first one was fascinating. I'm not going to get into the whole, I don't want to bore you or anyone with the second one was so awful that I took the Ouija board and burnt it.
Oh.
Yeah. It was just,
it's
I was going to die before I turned 35.
Oh.
Yeah. And it was very upsetting to the people around. I wasn't so upset about it, but it was, that's what happened. And I remember taking it into the backyard and burning it up. It was just,
yeah. That was the right thing to do.
yeah. The other one was right on target, but again, I'm not going to get into it. The other experience I had was fascinating because it played out in real life what the Ouija board said. So talk with us about the Ouija board.
Yeah, so the Ouija board is the 8th and final story in the Ghost Games collection. And unlike all the other stories, this one is nonfiction. I mean, this one is about my experience with the Ouija board. And it was truly and utterly terrifying. And I learned that, Ouija boards really sort of attract, as I say in the book, kind of the vermin of the spirit world, and that it's often spirits pretending. So if you think you're speaking with your grandmother, chances are you are not. And oftentimes, according to a lot of people, oftentimes, Ouija boards really just create sort of this entry portal so that these sort of vermin spirits can come into our world and wreak all kinds of havoc. And it was actually interesting because when I had my book launch, I had a virtual book launch and I also had an in-person book launch. And my in-person book launch was in this great space above sort of a Wiccan shop, a shop that sells magical goods, wands, crystals, enchanted jewelry, all that kind of stuff. And a friend of mine did the event, sort of helped design the event, and she brought a Ouija board to, sort of just have on a table and maybe people could play with it. And the owner of the Wiccan shop and event space was like, oh no, absolutely not. I don't even want this in here. And so we had to put it in the freezer. We kept it in the freezer because even sort of having it in, even if you're not playing with it, even sort of having it, some people believe kind of is an invitation to unwanted spirits. So yeah, and again, I'm not going to give away what happens in this story, but I did learn that Ouija boards are definitely not good, and I no longer play with them.
Yeah, I haven't for many years, many years after it. It's too weird. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. Just like I say, it with the people that were there, it started to freak people out. I mean, I think I was going to die before I turned. No, but what
clearly you did.
What you clearly I did. That's how weird was that, and where did that come from? And I was done. I haven't touched one since.
Yeah,
I've been curious. Very honestly, I've been curious. yet.
Well, and
Not curious enough to do it again.
Well, they're interesting. I mean, it is interesting, and it's a very freaky feeling when the planchette starts moving, and and you're like, oh, it says Parker Brothers on the bottom. Like, how bad can it really be? But they're not good.
And again, you have the warnings and their disclaimers about, don't play these games. Yes. Read about it, enjoy it. Don't play them. Don't try this at home. So,
exactly.
Right? Don't do this at home.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about availability of ghost games.
You can find it on Amazon. And or you can order it through Barnes and Noble. You can order it anywhere books are sold.
Good.
If anyone happens to live in Nevada County, it will be in some local bookstores sort of soon, within the next month or so. I'm also originally from Minnesota, and I'm hoping to eventually do an event there in the fall. Okay. So it will be in some bookstores in Minnesota as well. But yeah, you can pretty much find it anywhere.
Again, I get everywhere online. I always encourage people to try to buy it as close to home as possible.
Yes.
And with a lot of independent bookstores that closed over the last couple of years, I did not want to direct people to Barnes and Noble. And as I thought about that more, they're leasing or building in your community, and the people that work there are in your community. Yeah. So they, again, I've got a whole different thought. Obviously, independent booksellers would be number one, and they can order it for you.
Yep. Yes. I was just going to say, even if the bookseller doesn't carry it, they can still place an order. And I should also mention, there are also 5 signed copies that are at the store Wildcrafted, which is in Beacon, New York. And you can also order them online through Wildcrafted as well. That's a wonderful little kind of Wiccan shop as well, owned by a good friend of mine.
That's wonderful.
So you can get some signed copies there.
What part of New York?
It's in Beacon, New York. So upstate, I believe that's like kind of Hudson River Valley area, I think. Yeah.
That's cool. That's a good friend of yours.
Yes.
Owns that. That's very.
So again, the store is Wildcrafted.
Wildcrafted, probably wildcrafted.com, or
I believe so.
I'll check and I'll post. Okay. I'll get it posted up.
Okay.
Because again, that's interesting that you can get signed copies, and it's an independent store.
It is.
That's good. That's really good. Also, when you again seeing the book, you're going to be seeing your book that you wrote in bookstores. I can't even imagine what that will be like for you. It's like, I wrote that. I mean, you should be, if it's in the window, you should be, hey, I wrote that book. Right?
Yes. Yeah. And there are a lot of fabulous, small local booksellers here in this small town that I live in Northern California. And I'm so excited to be able, I'll probably go visit the books.
Well, yeah. I mean, it'd be great if they had a book signing.
Yeah. But this whole experience has been just incredibly, incredibly surreal. And it's been a very long journey in terms of getting the book published. And like I said, I had signed with one publisher originally, and that relationship didn't work out. And it just, having a book published, being able to hold a book in my hand that I wrote has been an absolute lifelong dream of mine. And
that dream came true.
Yes. And I hope to just be able to publish many, many more.
I feel certain that you will. The virtual launch, again, with COVID and everything, that we still don't know a lot about at this point. What was that like for you?
It was great. So I'm so used to doing things virtually now, because like I said, I'm a reading specialist and I have my own private practice. And so I see all my students over Zoom. And I'm so used to Zoom now that it was completely natural. And actually Louise, my
Our
friend,
mutual friend. Yeah.
yes, our mutual friend and my fantastic literary publicist, Louise Crawford, Brooklyn Social Media. She arranged the event, and she made it so that it was also a conversation with another fantastic author, who lives in Tahoe, not too far from me. And her name is Gail Brandeis. And Gail actually wrote a blurb for the book. And she also wrote a really fabulous collection of horror poetry. And so it was so fun to sort of have this Q&A, kind of little conversation about the book and about writing. And so I was really able to riff off of her, and I even got to pick her brain about, she's a very successful author. I got to pick her brain a bit about sort of the writing lifestyle, and how she balances everything. And the answer is she doesn't. No one balances everything. And she just kind of finds time, there'll be a 10-minute window and she's like, great, let me work on this. And, and that's just kind of how it goes in life sometimes. But anyway, so the virtual launch was great. We had trivia games, we had prizes. It was, and I guess this is just the world we live in now. More and more things are just going to happen over Zoom. But I am grateful that I got to have an in-person launch as well.
Sure.
That was important to me. So.
And that was great. But when you say that about Zoom, I know through, I keep saying I'm an old guy and have done radio for over 2 decades now, I believe. And it's interesting because when I was in radio, I'd never see the guest, it was on the phone. It'd be on a phone line, again, a couple of decades ago. And then Skype, I learned how to Skype, and it was great being able to see my guests. Again, I always prefer in studio. Well, that's not possible with most guests. So, but you are able to see them and make eye contact, which I think is wonderful. I had some students, I think, like college freshmen, something. And I was talking about Skyping. I felt, hey, I could, not bragging, but I know how to do Skype. I'll never forget. She said, oh, Skype. I haven't used Skype since I was in middle school or something like that. And boy, that made me feel old. Yeah. But now, and with Zoom, it's just so easy.
Yeah.
So much better.
Yeah.
I'm going to say better than Skype. I still will Skype if somebody is insistent on it. But
yeah. When I was living in Thailand, I of course used Skype quite a bit. And Zoom didn't exist. And I do prefer Zoom. I feel like Skype would go wonky a lot, and just I don't know. The connectivity was always a little off.
Yeah, I've had that experience also. I've had Zoom freeze up.
Yeah.
But it's more rare.
Yeah.
And it generally freezes for a few seconds and then back. So you roll with it. You just roll with it. But I agree with you on Zoom. And I'm thinking about the virtual launch. I know a playwright that they did a Zoom play during COVID where everybody was, all the actors were different, obviously different locations, and they did that. And some musicians that did, people became very creative.
Saturday Night Live was, they did some Zoom episodes.
Oh, did they?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Where everyone was on Zoom.
Oh, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware. I've got to ask you, do you write, Brooke MacKenzie, when it hits you? I mean, we talked about it earlier about the muse, do you have to, I had an author on many years ago who, when I asked him about the writing process, he had an old time clock. He had a shed in his backyard and an old time, he would punch in, he would take a lunch break and 2 other short breaks during the day. And he would sit in front of not a computer, a word processor, so he couldn't get distracted looking
Yep.
things up. But he had to, and he was a great author, regiment. I mean, it was very tight, and he would just concentrate. Another author I had on that talked about when they talk about writer's block, I talked to him. He said, when I have writer's block, he said, I have all my bills on the refrigerator. I go look at them, and then I sit down and write. Which, but for you, is there, how does it, I know you talked about it just coming through you.
Yeah.
But is there a time, is there, you ever need to, I hate to say force yourself, but.
Oh boy. Okay. So it really depends. When I was living in New York, and before I had a child, I taught at a school that was in sort of the North Bronx, in an area called Riverdale. And I was living in Manhattan, and so I spent a ton of time commuting to work on the subway or by bus. And then I would have my private practice tutoring students in the afternoon, which would mean that I was, coming back into the city and taking cabs and, running, taking the subway and running around all over the place. And so I wrote the entirety of that memoir in a notebook. I do prefer to do things like by hand. You mentioned your pen and paper planner, and I still have a pen and paper planner.
That's interesting because of your youth. I mean, people always say you should do it. You can do it on your phone. You can schedule. Yes, some people can. I'm just not that organized.
Well, and going back to talking about sort of the brain and science from earlier in our conversation, there is a lot of science that shows that writing things down, you store it in your memory better. You have a different relationship with the information. So I just carried that notebook with me, and whenever I was on the subway for a half hour, I would, if I'm sitting in the waiting room of a doctor's office, I'm writing. So it was just whenever there were these windows of time. My schedule has since become more flexible in some ways, in that, now I have my private practice, so I have a little more flexibility in terms of my working hours, but I also have a toddler.
Yes.
So now, I would love to be able to sit down, for big chunks of time and just write and write and write. I don't have the luxury of that at the moment. So I really just kind of try to find the time when I can. I do get a lot done on the days when my daughter goes to daycare 3 days a week. And I do get a lot done on those days. And in terms of the actual process, I mean, it's so funny because it changes with whatever it is I'm working on. I wrote a novel. I'm not sure if I'm a novelist. We'll see. We'll see. I don't know. Short fiction and poetry, seem to come a little more easily, but I wrote a novel. And for that, I mean, I had the whole bulletin board and the whiteboard, and I've got sticky notes, and I'm moving those around, and then I'm charting things on the whiteboard and whatever. And so that really required a lot of kind of organization and very careful planning. With the stories and ghost games, they sort of flowed a little more organically.
It's interesting.
And and then with the poetry collection, was really interesting because, and again, that was one that I mostly that I wrote by hand. And it would come out when, like, the poetry would come out when I needed some kind of emotional release. If I was feeling, I mean, these are very stressful times we're living in, particularly as a woman. And so when I needed some kind of stress relief, I would write these poems. So, it really all depends. And I basically just kind of leave it up to my muse, however she decides she wants to work is, and it's interesting because right now she's not speaking to me because she wanted me to get this poetry collection done, which I did. And she wants me to finish up the revisions on my novel, which I'm about to, hopefully by the end of this week, which is tomorrow, hopefully by tomorrow. And then we'll see what she has to say next.
When will that be published? Do you have any, you're finishing?
So the novel, the next step for that is for me to send it to, there's an editor that I work with, who's a dear friend of mine. And so the next step is for me to send it to her and send it to a couple of beta readers and sort of get some feedback, and then to start working on my query letter. So I'm not sure when that one will be published. The poetry collection has been submitted to a publisher, so we'll keep our fingers crossed on that one. But I will keep you posted.
Please
and
do.
You and I are Facebook friends now, so yeah.
Well, that's great. That's great. You know, see, I don't, my brain, you know, I'm glad to hear that. You know how to get a hold of me, Brooke MacKenzie also. But if someone wanted to know if you have a favorite or a few favorite poets.
Oh gosh. I have been I've been reading a lot of horror poetry lately. My absolute favorite, and I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Her first name is Christina and her last name is spelled SNG. And I can't believe that I don't know how to pronounce her name, but she's my absolute favorite horror poet right now. I love sort of old school, like I love William Butler Yeats. You know, he's one of my absolute favorites. And I spent a year in Ireland and just read him all the time, and that was incredible. There's a woman named Rita Dove and another woman named Joy Harjo, and they're both former poet laureates of the United States. And they're incredible. Joy Harjo in particular has really influenced my poetry. And there's a man named John Ashbery who has influenced my poetry quite a bit as well. And then in terms of other horror poets, there's a woman who also writes fiction, but her name is Cynthia Paleo. And she writes some really exceptional horror poetry as well. I don't know if, I mean, you wouldn't think that horror poetry is a thing, but it totally is. It has quite a following, you know.
I wouldn't be aware of that.
Like cult following. So let's see, who else? Yeah, I mean, I would say Joy Harjo is probably number one. Absolute favorite poet, hands down.
That's wonderful. And we think about from that to William Butler Yeats. It's just right. Well, again, you want different.
He's one of my absolute favorites. And again, it was so fun, you know, always sort of remind me of that time in my life as well, you know, living in Ireland and reading Yeats. And it just, you know, you can really see how the landscape and, you know, just the setting impacted his work, how it's just woven in there. And I've been reading some poetry by some local poets out here in Nevada City, California, because it's the same kind of thing. We're just, you know, the setting is so instrumental to the words that they're writing. So that's been it's been fun exploring, you know, discovering some local poets as well.
That's what you're wonderful, and I'm really glad that we got this, that I got it together, and we were able to schedule. And my apologies for earlier, because not only did I have the wrong time, but I had the right time in my book. I don't think I knew that you had moved from New York, so when I was communicating with you, it was very early.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, I was up.
When you said that about move, it's like, oh, yeah, right.
No worries at all.
Your website, take a minute and tell us about the website.
So that, again, going back to Louise Crawford from Brooklyn Social Media, my wonderful publicist, connected me with this incredible web designer named Ed Valandria. And he actually also designed the cover of my book.
Which I love.
Yeah. And I love the cover of this book. And so because you know, with the publisher that I was working with at the time, they were very slow and sort of, you know, giving me covers and thinking about what the book was going to look like. And so he just went ahead and designed it because he wanted to use that as sort of the basis of the design of the website. And that website has been a very extensive labor of love. It took us a long time, a lot of Zoom meetings, a lot of tweaking. But now it's, I mean, I need to write some more blog posts. I sort of have been neglecting that a little bit, but, now it's great. You can sign up for the newsletter. And when you sign up for the newsletter, you get a free PDF of the Three Kings game, which is one of the chapters in the book. And yeah, I mean, he totally, I mean, it's a work of art. He totally just took this concept
fantastic,
and ran with it. So yeah, I plan on having a very, very long and fruitful professional relationship with him.
Oh, that's wonderful. Again, you can get the book, of course, everywhere online. It can be ordered at Barnes & Noble or any independent bookseller. It's Ghost Games, Brooke MacKenzie, and the website is MacKenzie, MacKenzie.com. You can go directly there, or we've got it posted up at WFMJ.com, LouisFreeShow.com, and there's another one. I'm not sure. Like I always say, I have some young techies that are helping me with things like podcasting and uploading video to YouTube and things like that. I just push the buttons they tell me to. I just do what I'm told. So
good.
They're
good.
wonderful.
Yeah, just do what you're told. And
that's right. That's right. I rarely do what I'm told, but in this case, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. I've loved our conversation, and I know it was all over the place, very chaotic, but I've really enjoyed the flow of it, Brooke.
Yeah,
so we'll get you back sometime in the not too distant future. I would love to also.
Absolutely.
Say hi to hubby.
I will.
And give your little one, Maeve, a hug. I don't know.
I will.
Tell her I said hi.
Okay, I will.
She'll say, who said hi? Mom,
well, this
what?
has been fantastic. I really, really appreciate you having me. And thank you for your patience with all the rescheduling and everything. But,
thank you for your patience with rescheduling. It was, if you don't mind if I say, it was some on your end and then on my end. And then I had the wrong time in my head this morning, and then looked in the book. Of course, it was the right time. So we made it happen. And that's
we made it happen.
And I love you sharing the things about, obviously about Ireland and Thailand, but reading. And it's so important. So, and our library system also has, they've had reading to rabbits, where they program also reading to dogs, different dogs. And when I didn't understand it at first until it was explained, because even if you're trying to, the reading out loud, even if you're trying not to say anything, if your child mispronounces or struggles with a word, you're going to some body language or something, or you're going to take a breath or whatever. And but the dogs don't, and they're very successful programs, and the rabbits don't. I think it's anything to get them reading.
I love that. I love that. I actually wrote a whole article about parent body language when reading with your child.
Can you send it?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to. I'd love to read that.
Absolutely.
Brooke, thanks. I had a blast with you.
Thank you. Me too.
Thank you so much.
I'd love to do this again.
I would love to do it again with you. That is MacKenzie Ghost Games. Again, it's BAMacKenzie.com, MacKenzie.com. And I just absolutely loved speaking with her. So